My daughter-in-law handed me a cup of coffee minutes before a legal meeting that would have signed everything I owned away, and if the maid hadn't knocked it from my hands, I might not be here telling you this story today. I remember the exact weight of that porcelain cup in my fingers. Light, delicate, the kind Vanessa always insisted on using when she wanted to impress guests, even though it chipped easily and never held heat for long. She smiled when she gave it to me, a careful, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The same smile she'd been wearing for weeks, ever since Daniel started talking about simplifying things and making sure everything was taken care of. I didn't question it at first. At 68, you learn to ignore small discomforts, to smooth over awkward moments, especially when it comes to your own family. That morning, the house felt unusually quiet. The air carried the faint scent of vanilla from the candles Vanessa liked to burn, but beneath it there was something else, something sharper I couldn't quite place. Daniel had already left for a call, or at least that's what he said, and Vanessa had been moving through the kitchen with an efficiency that felt almost rehearsed, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors in steady, deliberate beats. "You should drink something before we go," she said, placing the cup into my hands. "It's going to be a long meeting." Her tone was gentle, almost caring, and for a moment I felt a flicker of guilt for the unease that had been sitting quietly in my chest these past few days. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe this was just how families change over time. I lifted the cup slightly, watching the steam curl upward in thin, ghost-like ribbons. Coffee. Just coffee. Something I had every morning for decades. But that morning, my hand paused for a fraction of a second longer than usual. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel it. That hesitation. That whisper of something not quite right. And then Elena moved. She had been standing near the doorway, silent as always, her presence easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But I had noticed her more lately. The way she watched Vanessa, the way her eyes lingered on Daniel when he spoke about finances, about paperwork, about transitions. She crossed the room quickly, too quickly, and before I could take a sip, her hand struck the bottom of the cup. The coffee spilled across my blouse, hot but not scalding, the porcelain shattering against the tile floor in a sharp, echoing crack that seemed louder than it should have been. "Elena!" Vanessa's voice cut through the silence, sharp and controlled, but there was something underneath it, something that didn't sound like simple irritation. It sounded like panic. I looked down at the spreading stain on my clothes, then back up at Elena. She didn't apologize right away. She didn't scramble or stammer the way someone would after an accident. Instead, she looked directly at me, her expression steady, almost pleading, as if she were trying to say something without using words. And in that moment, standing there with coffee dripping from my sleeve and broken porcelain at my feet, I felt it clearly for the first time. Not confusion, not doubt, but certainty. Something in that cup had not been meant to help me, and whatever Elena had just done, she had done it on purpose. That was the moment everything shifted, though no one else in that room seemed to realize it yet. Vanessa was already reaching for a towel, her movements quick, her smile returning as if she could smooth the moment away with enough charm. "It's fine," she said lightly. "Just a clumsy mistake. We'll make another cup." But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply stood there, feeling the last of the warmth fade from the coffee soaking into my blouse, and understood something I had been too willing to ignore. I was not being taken care of. I was being prepared. And whatever was supposed to happen next was not meant to end in my favor. I did not change out of my blouse right away, even though the fabric clung uncomfortably to my skin, cooling with every passing second, because something in me needed to sit with what had just happened, to let the moment settle instead of rushing past it the way I had done so many times before when things felt slightly off, but not enough to confront. Vanessa kept talking, her voice smooth and controlled as she dabbed at the counter with a towel, as if the broken cup and the spill were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But I noticed how her movements were sharper now, less graceful, as though something inside her rhythm had been interrupted. Daniel came back into the kitchen a minute later, drawn by the sound of the cup breaking, and he looked from the floor to me and then to Vanessa, his expression tightening for just a moment before settling into something neutral. "What happened?" he asked, But he did not step closer to me, did not reach out, did not even look directly into my eyes. "Just an accident," Vanessa answered quickly, too quickly, and I could feel the words land in the room before he had a chance to think. Elena was already on her knees, quietly gathering the larger pieces of porcelain, her hands steady, her eyes lowered now, as if she had returned to her usual place in the background. But I knew what I had seen earlier. That look had not been fear. It had been intention. "I will clean this up," she said softly, and her voice was calm in a way that did not match the situation. I nodded, more to myself than to anyone else, and finally stepped back, reaching for a napkin to press against the damp fabric of my sleeve. "I think I will skip the coffee," I said, my tone even, almost light, as if I were making a simple preference known rather than a decision that suddenly felt much heavier than it should have. Vanessa's eyes flickered toward me for a fraction of a second, and in that brief moment, something unguarded passed through them, something that looked dangerously close to disappointment. "We can make another one," she insisted, but I shook my head gently. "No, thank you. I feel fine." The word fine lingered in the air, and for the first time that morning, I noticed how quiet the house truly was. No television, no music, no distant hum of activity. Just the three of us, and the soft clinking of porcelain as Elena placed the broken pieces into a small trash bag. It reminded me of another silence, one I had lived with before, in the weeks after my husband passed, when every room felt too large and every sound echoed just a little too long. Back then, I had told myself that time would fill those spaces again, that family would bring warmth back into the house, and for a while it had, until it did not. "We should not be late," Daniel said finally, checking his watch, his voice measured, almost rehearsed, as if he were following a script he had already practiced in his head. I watched him as he spoke, really watched him, and saw things I had overlooked before, the way he avoided standing too close to me, the way his shoulders remained slightly turned toward Vanessa, even when he addressed me. The way his eyes moved, not freely, but carefully, as if he were choosing where to look. "Of course," I replied, setting the napkin aside and smoothing my sleeve, even though the stain remained. It did not matter. There were other things now that mattered far more. As we walked toward the front door, I slowed just enough to fall slightly behind them, giving myself a moment to observe without being observed. Vanessa reached for her purse, her movements composed again, her smile back in place as if nothing had happened, but I could still see the tension in the way she held her jaw. Daniel picked up his keys, and for a brief second he hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Helena was finishing up. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that I could not fully interpret, but it was enough to confirm what had already begun to take shape in my mind. This was not a single moment. It was part of something larger. Outside, the morning air felt cooler than I expected, carrying a faint breeze that brushed against my face as we stepped onto the driveway. I paused for just a second, looking back at the house, at the windows that reflected nothing but pale sky, and felt a strange sense of distance from a place I had once considered entirely my own. Then I turned and walked toward the car, my steps steady, my expression calm, because whatever was waiting for me at that meeting, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not walk into it unprepared. The drive to the law office took just under 20 minutes, the same route I had traveled dozens of times over the years. Yet that morning, every traffic light seemed to last a little longer, and every silence inside the car felt heavier than it should have been, as if the air itself were waiting for something to happen. I sat in the back seat, a habit I had developed after my husband passed, letting Daniel take the wheel while Vanessa sat beside him, her posture perfectly composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her wedding ring catching the light each time we passed beneath a street lamp. No one spoke for the first few miles. The radio was off. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the faint clicking of the turn signal as Daniel merged onto the main road. I watched the back of his head, the familiar shape of it, the same boy I had once brushed hair from his forehead when he was too young to sleep through the night, and I wondered at what point that quiet trust between us had shifted into something I no longer recognized. Vanessa was the first to break the silence. "The attorney said everything is ready," she said, her tone calm, measured, almost reassuring. "It should not take long. just a few signatures. A few signatures. The phrase echoed in my mind, simple on the surface, yet carrying a weight I could now feel pressing against the edges of my thoughts. I leaned back slightly, letting my gaze drift to the passing houses outside the window, each one standing in neat rows, each one holding lives I knew nothing about. And for a brief moment I wondered how many of those homes contained stories that looked calm from the outside, but felt entirely different within. "That is good," I replied, keeping my voice steady, neutral, giving nothing away. Vanessa turned her head just enough to glance at me, her smile returning once more, but it lingered a fraction too long, as if she were waiting for something in my expression that never came. Daniel cleared his throat softly, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "It is just a formality, Mom," he added, not looking back. "It will make things easier moving forward." Easier for whom, I thought, but I did not say it out loud. Instead, I let the words settle between us, the way so many unspoken things had settled over the years, forming layers that were easy to ignore until they became impossible to move through. As we approached the office building, a tall structure of glass and steel that reflected the pale morning sky, I felt a strange sense of clarity begin to replace the unease that had followed me since the kitchen. The pieces were not fully formed yet, but they were there, waiting to be arranged. The coffee, Alina's eyes, Vanessa's reaction, Daniel's silence. None of it stood alone. It was all connected. The car came to a smooth stop in front of the entrance, and Daniel stepped out first, walking around to open my door as he always had, his movements polite, practiced, but distant in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. I accepted his hand as I stepped onto the sidewalk, my balance steady, my posture composed, and for a moment our eyes met. There was something there, something buried beneath whatever he had convinced himself of, but it passed too quickly to hold on to. Inside, the lobby was quiet, the marble floors polished to a soft shine, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air from a small station near the reception desk. I noticed it immediately, that smell, and for a brief second my stomach tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. I had almost taken a sip. We walked toward the elevator together, our reflections appearing in the mirrored doors as we waited. 3 people standing side by side, looking like a family from the outside, yet separated by something none of the glass could show. Vanessa adjusted her sleeve slightly, her movements precise, controlled, as if every detail mattered. Daniel checked his watch again. I simply stood there, watching, listening, letting the silence speak in ways words never could. When the elevator doors opened, we stepped inside, and as the doors closed behind us, I realized that whatever truth had been hidden from me was no longer entirely out of reach. It was close now, close enough that I could almost feel it waiting on the other side of whatever came next. The elevator ride was short, but in that confined space, every second seemed to stretch. The quiet hum of the machinery beneath our feet, blending with the steady rhythm of my own thoughts as they began to settle into something clearer, something more deliberate than the vague unease I had been carrying for days. When the doors opened, Vanessa stepped out first, her confidence returning fully now, her heels echoing softly against the polished hallway as she led the way toward the conference room, as if she had been here many times before, as if this place belonged to her more than it did to me. Daniel followed just behind her, his posture straight, his expression composed, but I noticed the small details again, the way his hand brushed the edge of his jacket as if checking for something, the way his gaze avoided mine when I came up beside him. I said nothing. I did not need to. The silence between us had already begun to reveal more than any conversation could. The conference room door was already open when we arrived, and inside sat Mr. Harrison, the attorney who had handled our family matters for years, a man who had once shared quiet conversations with my husband about long-term plans, about protecting what we had built together. He stood as we entered, offering a polite smile, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes when he looked at me, something that lingered just a fraction longer than usual, as if he were searching for confirmation of something he could not yet say out loud. "Mrs. Collins," he greeted, his tone warm but measured. It is good to see you." I nodded, taking my seat at the long table, placing my hands gently in front of me, feeling the cool surface beneath my fingertips. Vanessa moved to sit beside Daniel, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, a united front presented without effort. Mr. Harrison began to arrange the documents in front of him, neat stacks of paper that seemed ordinary at a glance, but now carried a weight I could feel even from across the table. "We have prepared everything as discussed," he said, his voice steady, professional. "This is a straightforward transfer of assets into a consolidated structure, intended to simplify management and ensure continuity." Simplify, ensure. Words that sounded safe, reassuring, but I had lived long enough to know that words could be shaped to hide as much as they revealed. He slid the first set of documents toward me, the pages crisp, the text precise, lines of legal language that stretched on with careful clarity. I did not reach for the pen immediately. Instead, I read. Slowly, carefully, and as my eyes moved across the page, I began to see it. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but in pieces that connected themselves with quiet certainty. Ownership shifted, authority reassigned, control transferred. Not shared, not balanced, transferred. My name appeared less and less as the pages went on, replaced by structures, entities, and signatures that pointed in one direction only, toward Daniel, toward Vanessa. I lifted my gaze slightly, not fully, just enough to observe without drawing attention, and I saw Vanessa watching me, her expression composed, patient, but beneath it there was something else, something waiting. Daniel sat still, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the documents as if he were reading along, though I could tell he already knew every line. "If you have any questions, we can go through them together," Mr. Harrison offered, and there was a subtle emphasis in his tone, a slight pause before the word questions, as if he were giving me space to see what needed to be seen. I turned another page, my fingers steady, my breathing even, and for a moment I thought about the kitchen again, about the cup in my hand, about the timing, about Alina's eyes. A few signatures, that was what Vanessa had said, just a few signatures. I closed the folder gently, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw alarm, just enough to mark a pause. And then I looked up fully, meeting Mr. Harrison's gaze directly for the first time since we had entered the room. Something passed between us then, silent but clear, an understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. I was not as unaware as they believed, and whatever they had planned, it had not unfolded the way they expected. I did not reach for the pen, and that small delay was enough to shift the entire rhythm of the room, though no one acknowledged it directly. Instead, I placed my hands lightly on top of the closed folder and let a quiet moment stretch just long enough to feel deliberate. "Mr. Harrison," I said calmly, my voice steady, "before I sign anything, I would like to understand something clearly." Vanessa's posture changed almost imperceptibly beside Daniel, her shoulders tightening just slightly, her smile remaining but losing a fraction of its ease. Daniel exhaled softly, as if preparing himself for a minor inconvenience rather than a turning point. Mr. Harrison inclined his head, giving me his full attention. "Of course," he replied. "Please go ahead." I opened the folder again, not to read from it this time, but to hold it in place, to anchor the conversation in something tangible. "These documents," I continued, "they move full authority over my assets into a structure that I no longer directly control. Is that correct?" There was no accusation in my tone, only clarity, and that made it harder to dismiss. Mr. Harrison paused for the briefest moment, then answered carefully. "They transfer management authority, yes, while still providing you with certain protections and access." Certain protections, certain access. Words that sounded reasonable, but no longer convincing. I nodded slowly, as if considering his explanation, and then turned my gaze slightly toward Daniel. "And this was your idea?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. "It is what we thought would be best, Mom," he said finally, his voice softer now, less certain. "We." I let that word settle in the space between us.
before shifting my attention to Vanessa. She met my eyes without hesitation, her expression composed, almost serene. "We want to make things easier for you," she said gently. "You should not have to worry about managing everything at this stage."
At this stage, I had heard that phrase before. It was always said with kindness, always wrapped in concern, but it carried an assumption beneath it, one that suggested decline, dependence, a quiet stepping aside. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands still calm, my breathing even, and allowed a faint, thoughtful smile to touch my lips. "That is very considerate," I said. "Truly." Vanessa's eyes flickered again, searching for something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps relief, but I gave her neither. Instead, I turned back to Mr. Harrison. "I would like a few minutes to review this privately," I added. The request was simple, reasonable, and yet it introduced something new into the room, something that had not been part of their plan. Daniel shifted in his seat. "Mom, we have already gone through everything," he said, his tone tightening just slightly. "There is no need to overcomplicate it." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment I saw the boy he had been, layered beneath the man he had become, and it made what I said next feel both heavier and clearer. "If it is as simple as you say," I replied quietly, "then a few more minutes will not change anything." The room fell silent again. Not the empty kind of silence from before, but one filled with tension, with expectation, with something beginning to unravel at the edges. Mr. Harrison nodded once. "Of course," he said. "Take all the time you need." Vanessa's smile returned, but it was thinner now, more controlled, as if she were holding it in place rather than wearing it naturally. "We can step outside," she offered, already beginning to rise. I shook my head gently. "No," I said, my tone still calm, still measured. "I would prefer if you stayed." That was when I saw it clearly, not in words, but in the subtle shifts that followed. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Daniel's jaw set slightly, his eyes lowering once more. They had expected compliance. They had prepared for agreement. They had not prepared for this. And in that quiet moment, as I sat there with the documents still open in front of me and the truth settling firmly into place, I understood something with complete certainty. Whatever had been meant to happen to me today was no longer in their control. The moment stretched just long enough for everyone in the room to realize that something had shifted, even if they could not yet name it, and I let that silence settle fully before I moved again, before I spoke again, because for the first time since we had sat down, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was guiding it. I turned another page slowly, deliberately, my fingers steady against the paper, and I began to read sections out loud, with accusation, not with emotion, but with quiet precision. "All primary decision-making authority shall be transferred to the managing parties," I read, my voice even. Then I paused just slightly before continuing, "including, but not limited to, financial distribution, asset liquidation, and long-term estate restructuring." The words hung in the air, no longer hidden behind legal language, no longer softened by explanation. Daniel shifted in his seat, a small movement, but enough. Vanessa did not move at all. "This means," I continued, lifting my eyes just enough to meet Mr. Harrison's gaze briefly before returning to the page, "that I would no longer have direct control over any of my assets." Mr. Harrison folded his hands together, his expression careful, his silence telling me more than any immediate answer could. "There are safeguards in place," he said finally, but his voice had changed, just slightly, as if he understood that I no longer needed reassurance. I closed the folder again, this time with intention, and placed it gently on the table in front of me. "I see," I said. 2 simple words, nothing more, but they carried everything that needed to be understood. Vanessa leaned forward then, just a fraction, her voice soft, persuasive, the same tone she had used so many times before when guiding conversations in directions that seemed harmless at first. "Margaret, this is about protecting you," she said. About making sure everything is handled properly so you do not have to worry. Protecting me. I let the phrase settle, not challenging it, not rejecting it, just allowing it to exist in the open, where it could be seen for what it was. And the timing? I asked calmly. That was the first question that did not have an easy answer. Daniel looked up, his brow tightening slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked. I held his gaze for a moment longer than I had all morning. This meeting, today, the urgency. I paused, just long enough for the memory of the kitchen to surface again in my mind, clear and sharp. The coffee. The word was quiet, almost casual, but it landed heavily. Vanessa's expression did not change immediately, but there was a stillness in her that had not been there before, a pause that lasted just a fraction too long. "What about it?" she asked, her tone controlled but thinner now. I did not look at her right away. Instead, I let my eyes move slowly from the folder to Daniel, then finally to her. "I almost drank it," I said simply. The room fell into a different kind of silence then, one that did not belong to uncertainty anymore, but to recognition. Mr. Harrison did not speak. He did not need to. Daniel's face shifted, confusion rising first, then something else beneath it, something unsettled. "Mom, it was just coffee," he said, but the confidence in his voice was gone. Vanessa smiled again, but this time it was different. It did not reach her eyes at all. "You are overthinking this," she replied lightly. "It was an accident." I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "Perhaps," I said. Then I leaned back slightly in my chair, my posture relaxed, my tone still calm, still measured. "Then I am sure you will not mind if we take a different approach today." That was the moment the balance shifted completely. Vanessa's fingers tightened against the table, just slightly, but enough for me to see it. Daniel looked between us, uncertain now, caught between what he had believed and what he was beginning to question. "What kind of approach?" he asked. I met his eyes, steady, unflinching. "One where I do not sign anything until I have had these documents reviewed independently," I said. "And one where no one makes decisions on my behalf without my full and informed consent." The words were simple, but they changed everything. Because now it was no longer about the documents. It was no longer about the meeting. It was about control. And for the first time that day, it was clear that control no longer belonged to them. No one spoke for several seconds after I finished, and in that silence I could feel the entire structure they had built beginning to loosen. Not collapsing yet, but no longer solid, no longer certain. Vanessa was the first to move, though it was subtle, just a shift in her posture, a slight straightening of her shoulders, as if she were adjusting her approach rather than abandoning it. "Margaret," she said softly, her voice carefully measured, "there is no need to make this more complicated than it has to be." I looked at her then, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm attention that I had not given her before. And for the first time I noticed how much of her confidence depended on being believed without question. "Clarity is not complication," I replied. "It is protection." The word protection lingered between us, no longer belonging to her explanation, but to mine. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face as if trying to gather his thoughts into something he could still control. "Mom, we are just trying to help," he said, and there was something in his voice now that sounded less like certainty and more like insistence, as if repeating the idea might make it true. I turned slightly toward him, my expression softening just enough to acknowledge the part of him that still wanted to believe that. "Then help me understand," I said quietly. "Why was everything arranged so quickly? Why today?" He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out immediately, and in that pause, something else filled the space. Doubt. Not mine. His. Vanessa stepped in before he could find it. "Because it is efficient," she said smoothly. "Because delays create unnecessary risks." Risks. Another word chosen carefully. Another word meant to guide the conversation back into familiar territory. I nodded slowly, as if accepting the explanation, but I did not let the moment pass. "And the coffee?" I asked again, my tone unchanged, my gaze steady. This time, the reaction was different. Not immediate denial, not quick dismissal. just a brief, almost imperceptible stillness that spread across Vanessa's face before she spoke. "It was an accident," she repeated, but the words did not carry the same ease they had before. I let the silence follow her answer, long enough for it to feel complete, long enough for everyone in the room to hear what was not being said. Then I turned my attention back to Mr. Harrison. "If I choose not to sign today," I asked calmly, "there are no immediate consequences, correct?" He met my gaze directly, and this time there was no hesitation in his response. "No," he said, "there are none." That answer settled the matter more clearly than anything else that had been said. I placed both hands flat on the table, grounding myself in the decision that had already formed. "Then I will not be signing today," I said. The words were simple, but they carried finality. Vanessa's composure tightened, just slightly, the edges of her calm beginning to show strain. "Margaret, that is not necessary," she said, her voice still controlled, but no longer as smooth. "We have already gone through everything." I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. "You have gone through everything. I have only just begun." Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time that morning, I saw something shift in his expression, something that looked like uncertainty giving way to realization. "Mom," he said quietly, "what are you thinking?" I held his gaze, steady, unflinching. "I am thinking," I said, "that something was meant to happen today that did not go the way it was planned." The room went still again, but this time it was different. Not tense, not uncertain, but exposed. Because now the truth was no longer hidden beneath documents or explanations. It was sitting in the open, quiet and undeniable, waiting for someone to challenge it. No one did. And in that silence, I understood something with complete clarity. Whatever they had expected from me when I walked into that room, it was no longer something they were going to receive. Vanessa's smile faded first. Not completely, but enough to reveal the tension beneath it, the careful control beginning to slip in small, almost invisible ways. And I watched it happen without interrupting, without pressing, because there was no need to rush what was already unfolding on its own. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes moving between us, trying to reconcile two versions of the same moment, the one he had expected and the one that was now in front of him, and I could see the uncertainty settling into him more deeply with each passing second. Mr. Harrison remained still, his presence quiet but no longer neutral, his attention fixed on me in a way that suggested he understood that whatever happened next would not follow the script that had been prepared. I reached forward and gently closed the folder once more, this time sliding it a few inches away from me across the table, not abruptly, not in rejection, but in quiet finality. "We are done here for today," I said, my voice calm, measured, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Vanessa's hand moved slightly on the table, her fingers pressing against the surface as if grounding herself. "Margaret, you are making a mistake," she said, and this time there was no softness in her tone, only control held tightly in place. I tilted my head just slightly, considering her words as if they were new information, rather than something I had already weighed. "No," I replied evenly, "I am correcting one." That was when Daniel spoke again, his voice lower now, less certain than before. "Mom, what exactly do you think is going on?" he asked, and there was something in his expression that had not been there earlier, something closer to concern than persuasion. I met his eyes, holding his gaze long enough for the moment to settle. "I think," I said slowly, "that I was meant to walk into this room and sign away everything without asking a single question." I paused, letting the words stand on their own before continuing. And I think something interrupted that plan. I did not look at Vanessa when I said it, but I did not need to. The shift beside him was enough. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat softly, a subtle acknowledgement of the tension that now filled the room. "Mrs. Collins," he said carefully, "if you would like, I can provide copies of all documents for independent review." I nodded once. "I would appreciate that." Vanessa turned toward him then, her composure tightening again, but there was an edge to it now, something sharper than before. "There is no need to complicate matters further," she said, her voice controlled but firm. "Everything has already been reviewed."
Mr. Harrison did not look at her when he answered. "It is always appropriate for a client to seek independent counsel," he said, his tone professional, neutral, but no longer aligned with her direction. That small shift said more than anything else in the room. I stood then, slowly, deliberately, my movements steady, giving myself time to feel the full weight of the moment without letting it overwhelm me. Daniel stood as well, almost automatically, his eyes still searching mine for something he could hold on to. Vanessa remained seated for a fraction longer before rising, her posture straight, her expression composed once more, but now I could see the effort it took to maintain it. "We can discuss this at home," she said, her tone returning to something softer, something controlled, as if the conversation could still be redirected, contained.
I looked at her, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a clarity that no longer needed to be hidden. "No," I said quietly, "we will not." The words settled between us with a kind of stillness that could not be undone. I turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to meet Mr. Harrison's gaze once more. "Please have the copies sent to my address," I added, "and from this point forward, I would prefer that all matters concerning my estate be handled directly with me." He nodded once, understanding completely. I stepped out into the hallway then, the sound of the door closing behind me softer than I expected, and for a moment I simply stood there, breathing in the quiet, feeling the distance between who I had been when I entered that building and who I was now as I walked away. Because something had changed, not just in that room, not just in their plan, but in me. I was no longer waiting to understand what was happening around me. I already did. And for the first time that day, I knew exactly what I would do next. The hallway felt quieter than it should have been, the kind of quiet that settles after something important has already happened, even if no one else has fully acknowledged it yet. And I walked slowly toward the elevator, not because I was unsure, but because I was no longer in a hurry. For years, I had moved through my own life with a kind of quiet trust, believing that the people closest to me would always have my best interests at heart. That family meant something steady and unspoken, something that did not need to be questioned. But trust, I realized, is not something that disappears all at once. It fades in small moments, in overlooked details, in conversations that feel slightly off but are easy to dismiss. And this morning, all of those moments had finally come together. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped inside alone, watching my reflection in the mirrored walls as the doors closed. I looked the same as I had when I arrived, the same posture, the same calm expression, but something behind my eyes had changed, something sharper, clearer, no longer willing to be guided without question. When I reached the lobby, I did not go straight outside. Instead, I turned slightly and walked toward the reception desk, where a small seating area overlooked the street. I sat down, placing my purse beside me, and took a slow breath, letting the stillness settle fully this time. I was not leaving in a rush. I was choosing what came next. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me, familiar ones, and I did not need to turn to know who it was. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his presence hesitant in a way I had never seen before. "Mom," he said quietly. I turned then, meeting his eyes, and for the first time that day there was no distance in my gaze, no avoidance, just clarity. "Did you know?" The question was simple, but it held everything that mattered. He hesitated, and that hesitation was enough. His eyes shifted, his shoulders lowered slightly, and in that small, silent admission, I understood more than any explanation could have given me. "I thought it was just paperwork," he said finally, his voice unsteady. "I did not know. I did not know it was like that." I held his gaze for a moment longer, weighing the truth in his words, and I believed part of it. Not all of it, but enough. "And the coffee?" I asked, my tone unchanged. He looked confused then, genuinely so, and shook his head. "I have no idea what you are talking about," he said. I nodded once. That answer, too, told me what I needed to know. Vanessa was behind him now, her presence composed, controlled, as if nothing in that room upstairs had truly affected her. "We should go," she said, her voice calm, but there was something colder beneath it now, something no longer hidden behind politeness. I stood slowly, smoothing my sleeve out of habit, even though the faint stain remained, a quiet reminder of how close I had come to missing everything. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw her clearly, not as the woman my son had married, not as part of my family, but as someone who had calculated every step leading up to that morning. "No," I said softly, "you should go." The words were not loud, not forceful, but they carried a finality that did not need to be explained. Daniel looked between us, caught again in that space he had helped create, but no longer able to control. "Mom," he began, but I raised my hand gently, stopping him before he could continue. "I will be in touch," I said, "on my terms." That was the last thing I gave him. Not anger, not accusation, just distance. The kind that cannot be undone with explanations or apologies that come too late. I picked up my purse and walked toward the glass doors, pushing them open and stepping out into the daylight, the air cool and steady against my skin. The city moved around me as it always had, cars passing, people walking, life continuing without pause. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely present in it. I had not lost anything that day. Not my home, not my independence, not myself. What I had lost was something else entirely, something that had already been slipping away long before I noticed. And as I walked forward, away from the building, away from everything that had almost happened inside it, I understood one final truth with absolute certainty. They had planned for me to be unprepared. They had counted on my silence. They had mistaken my patience for weakness. And that was the one mistake they would never get the chance to correct.